The year was 1588, and in the opulent chambers of Blois Castle, something unspeakable was beginning to unfold. A stench so vile, so overwhelming, that seasoned courtiers would flee gasping for air. Servants collapsed at doorways, their faces twisted in revulsion as they encountered an odour that seemed to emanate from the very depths of hell itself. This wasn't the smell of death approaching. This was something far more horrifying. This was the smell of someone rotting alive from the inside out, while still breathing, still thinking, still desperately clinging to power. The woman producing this nauseating reek had once been the most feared and respected figure in all of Europe. She had controlled kings, orchestrated massacres, and held an entire kingdom together through sheer force of will for 3 decades. Now she lay in her bed, her body literally decomposing while her heart still beat, watching helplessly as everything she had sacrificed her soul to build crumbled into dust around her. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of a royal death. It's the account of one of history's most agonizing endings, where political catastrophe and physical horror merged into 13 days of unimaginable suffering. We're going to explore medical records that were almost too disturbing to document, witness testimonies that reveal the true extent of human endurance, and political machinations that would make Machiavelli himself recoil in disgust. But to understand the full nightmare of these final weeks, we need to understand who this woman was and why her gruesome end would send shockwaves across an entire continent. This is the story of Catherine de' Medici, and how the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe spent her last days on Earth drowning in her own bodily fluids while watching her life's work collapse in spectacular fashion. Let me paint you a picture of France in September 1588. The kingdom was fracturing along religious lines, with Catholic and Protestant factions tearing each other apart in what historians would later call the Wars of Religion. At the center of this chaos stood a woman who had spent 30 years playing these groups against each other like pieces on a chessboard, always ensuring that royal authority remained supreme above all else. Catherine de' Medici wasn't born to rule. She came to France as a 14-year-old Italian orphan, mocked by the French nobility as nothing more than a merchant's daughter. Her marriage to the future King Henry II was purely political, and for the first decade, it seemed doomed to failure. She couldn't produce children. Her husband was openly devoted to his mistress, who was 20 years older than Catherine, and the court treated her as an expensive decoration rather than a future queen. But Catherine possessed something that would prove more valuable than royal blood or natural beauty. She had an absolutely ruthless intelligence, combined with a willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve her goals. When she finally began bearing children, she produced 10 of them over 12 years. When her husband died in a jousting accident in 1559, she seamlessly transitioned into the role of Queen Mother, effectively ruling France through her young son, Francis II. The genius of Catherine's political strategy lay in her understanding that survival meant balance. France was split between Catholics who wanted to maintain traditional religious authority and Protestants who demanded reform. Rather than choosing sides, Catherine played them against each other, ensuring that neither faction became powerful enough to threaten royal control. She would negotiate with Protestant leaders one day and order Catholic ceremonies the next, always keeping everyone guessing about her true intentions. This balancing act required extraordinary political skill, but it also demanded moral compromises that would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. The most notorious example came in 1572 during what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. While historians still debate Catherine's exact role, what's certain is that thousands of Protestant nobles and commoners were slaughtered during what was supposed to be a celebration of her daughter's wedding. Whether Catherine ordered the killings, permitted them, or simply failed to prevent them remains one of history's great controversies. What's undeniable is that the massacre worked politically. Protestant resistance was shattered for years, allowing Catherine to maintain her careful balance of power. she had learned the fundamental lesson that would guide her entire career. Sometimes, preserving stability required getting blood on your hands. By 1588, Catherine had outlived her husband, ruled through 3 of her sons who became kings, and survived 8 separate civil wars. Foreign ambassadors knew that to negotiate with France meant negotiating with Catherine. Her enemies called her the Black Queen or Madame Serpent, but they all recognized her as the real power behind the throne. Then everything began to unravel at once. The catalyst was a man named Henry, Duke of Guise, who had become more popular than the king himself. While Catherine's son, Henry III, was seen as weak and indecisive, known more for his elaborate court ceremonies and his devotion to his male favourites, the Duke of Guise embodied everything the French people wanted in a leader. He was masculine, commanding, and utterly devoted to the Catholic cause. The humiliation reached its peak in May 1588, during what became known as the Day of the Barricades. The Duke of Guise entered Paris against the king's direct orders, and when Henry III tried to bring in troops to arrest him, the entire city rose up in revolt. Barricades appeared in every street. The king's soldiers were surrounded and disarmed, and Henry III was forced to flee his own capital in disguise, while the Duke of Guise restored order with a simple gesture. Think about that for a moment. The King of France, supposedly God's chosen representative on earth, had to run from his own people, while his subject played king in his place. For Catherine, who had spent decades building up royal authority, this was an unthinkable disaster. But even as she watched her political world collapse, something far more sinister was beginning to happen to her body. The first symptoms appeared as what her physicians called a severe lung infection, but this was no ordinary illness. Catherine was developing a condition that would transform her final months into a medical horror story. The disease attacking Catherine's lungs was called pleurisy, an inflammation of the membranes surrounding the lungs that made every breath feel like being stabbed with a sword. But Catherine's case quickly progressed beyond simple inflammation. Infected fluid began accumulating in her chest cavity, compressing her lungs and making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Imagine trying to inhale with someone sitting on your chest, and that weight getting heavier every single day. The fluid in Catherine's lungs wasn't just uncomfortable, it was infected, filled with bacteria that would soon begin producing the horrific smell that would drive servants from her chambers. Modern medicine could have cured Catherine easily with antibiotics and fluid drainage procedures. She would have recovered completely within weeks. But 16th century physicians had no understanding of bacterial infection or sterile technique. Their treatments, bloodletting, purging, and applying heated cups to the chest actually made things worse by weakening her body when she needed every ounce of strength to fight the infection. As autumn turned to winter, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. The infected fluid in her chest cavity increased daily, and with it came new horrors. Her skin began taking on a greyish hue as her oxygen levels dropped. Her fingernails curved and turned blue from chronic hypoxia. Most disturbing of all, her body began producing an odour so putrid that even hardened court physicians struggled not to vomit in her presence. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. Contemporary accounts describe it as unlike anything witnesses had ever encountered. The infected fluid in Catherine's lungs was being colonised by anaerobic bacteria that produce gases and compounds smelling like rotting meat, sulphur and decay. For a woman who had always been fastidious about her appearance and hygiene, who had introduced perfumed gloves to the French court and had her clothes scented with costly aromatics, this degradation must have been particularly humiliating. But Catherine couldn't rest. She couldn't retreat to her bed and focus on fighting the disease slowly killing her, because France was falling apart, and she was the only person who understood how to hold it together. The political crisis had escalated beyond anything Catherine had faced in 30 years of crisis management. The Catholic League, led by the Duke of Guise, now controlled more territory than the crown itself. They had taken Paris, most of northern France, and commanded the loyalty of the vast Catholic majority. King Henry III, by contrast, controlled almost nothing. Even worse, the Duke of Guise wasn't content to simply challenge royal authority. He wanted to replace it entirely. Foreign ambassadors visited him before they visited the king. Some didn't bother visiting the king at all. The Duke walked through royal palaces like he owned them, held court in rooms larger than the king's, and accepted the kind of deference that should have been reserved for royalty. Catherine understood exactly what was happening, because she had orchestrated similar scenarios herself when it served her purposes. The Duke of Guise was systematically delegitimizing royal authority by demonstrating that he commanded more respect, more loyalty, and more practical power than the actual king. It was a masterful political strategy, and it was working perfectly. In October 1588, Catherine hauled herself from her sickbed to attend the opening of the Estates General at Blois, despite her worsening condition. This gathering of representatives from the clergy, nobility, and common people was supposed to help Henry III regain control of the situation. Instead, it became his ultimate humiliation. The Catholic League dominated all three estates. When Henry III entered the Great Hall for the opening ceremony, the representatives barely acknowledged him. But when the Duke of Guise entered, the entire assembly erupted in cheers that could be heard throughout the castle. Catherine, listening from her chambers, could hear each celebration of the Duke as another nail in her dynasty's coffin. The estates immediately began undermining what remained of royal authority. They demanded the king reaffirm all his previous concessions to the League, proposed reforms that would have reduced Henry III to a powerless figurehead, and even refused to authorize new taxes for the war against the Protestants, leaving the crown essentially bankrupt. Every day brought fresh humiliations, and Catherine could do nothing but lie in her bed, drowning in her own infected fluids, listening to reports of each new disaster. The woman who had once controlled European politics through whispered conversations and carefully orchestrated negotiations was reduced to dictating desperate letters between bouts of delirium, still trying to find some path forward that didn't end in complete catastrophe. She must have known it was hopeless. A woman who had survived 8 civil wars and outlasted every enemy could read the political weather better than anyone. The storm was coming, and this time she wouldn't be able to navigate through it. By December, Catherine's physical condition had become genuinely nightmarish. The infected fluid in her chest cavity had reached such levels that she could no longer lie flat without feeling like she was drowning. She had to sleep propped up on pillows, fighting for every breath, while fever came and went in waves that sometimes spiked so high she became delirious. During these episodes of delirium, servants reported that Catherine would ramble about old secrets, old crimes, old regrets. She supposedly confessed to various poisonings and assassinations, though historians debate whether these were actual admissions or the ravings of a fevered mind. What's certain is that she said things during these episodes that made even her most devoted attendants uncomfortable. The worst part was her awareness during the lucid intervals. She would suddenly focus, recognize the people around her, and ask what she had said while delirious. When they wouldn't tell her, she would become agitated, which would trigger more coughing, more pain, and more of that horrible rattling sound as the infected fluid moved in her chest. Her chest, December 22nd, marked the beginning of the end, though Catherine didn't know it yet. Her son, Henry III, appeared in her chambers that evening, looking haggard and desperate. He had been acting strangely for days, praying obsessively, flagellating himself, muttering about divine guidance and unbearable humiliations. The conversation between mother and son that night has been lost to history, but servants outside the door reported raised voices, or rather one raised voice, since Catherine could barely manage more than a whisper by then. What they heard was Henry shouting about honor, about dignity, about the endless parade of insults he'd endured from the Duke of Guise. Catherine's response was too weak for anyone to make out, but after the king left, witnesses say she tried desperately to get out of bed. She actually managed to stand, clutching the bedpost before collapsing back onto her mattress in a violent coughing fit that left blood spattered across her pillows. She kept repeating something, but her voice had become so faint that no one could understand the words. Perhaps it was a prayer. Perhaps it was a curse. Or perhaps, with the political instincts that had kept her alive for 7 decades, she somehow sensed what her son was planning and was trying to warn someone, anyone, about the catastrophe that was about to unfold. At 6 a.m. on December 23rd, the Duke of Guise received a message that the king wanted to see him in his private chambers. It was hardly an unusual request, but several people warned the Duke not to go. One of his servants found a note under his breakfast plate that simply read, "Be careful, the king means to kill you." The Duke laughed it off, reportedly saying he wouldn't dare. What happened next would vindicate every one of Catherine's worst fears about her son's political judgment. At 8 a.m, the Duke entered the king's antechamber, which was unusually crowded with members of the royal guard, though they were dressed as servants and courtiers. The Duke noticed something was wrong, but he had faced down armies in his lifetime. What were a few bodyguards? The king called out from his private cabinet, "Maintenance! Now!" The disguised guards drew their daggers. Even surprised and outnumbered, the Duke of Guise was a formidable opponent. He was a large man, powerful, a veteran of countless battles. He grabbed one attacker by the beard, threw another against the wall, fought with desperate strength even as the blades found their marks. But there were simply too many of them. The daggers pierced his back, his chest, his throat, until finally he collapsed at the foot of the king's bed, his blood painting the walls of the royal chamber. King Henry III emerged from his hiding place. Yes, hiding. The King of France had hidden while his guards committed murder, and stared down at the corpse. "My God, he's big," he reportedly said. "He looks even bigger dead than alive." Then, still spattered with the Duke's blood, Henry rushed to tell his mother what he had done. Catherine was taking medicine when her son burst into her chamber, wild-eyed and babbling about what had just occurred. Some accounts suggest she had heard the commotion from her room directly below the king's chambers. The crashing, the screaming, the sounds of a man fighting for his life. Others claim she knew nothing until Henry appeared in her doorway, trembling and incoherent. Her reaction, even through the haze of illness and medication, was immediate and devastatingly accurate. "You have cut out, my son," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rattling in her chest. "But now you must sew together." Think about the precision of those words. She didn't ask why he had done it. She didn't express shock or horror. Her mind went straight to the political consequences, to the impossible task that lay ahead. You've torn the fabric of France by murdering its most popular leader. Now try to stitch it back together. Catherine understood what Henry apparently didn't grasp. You cannot assassinate your way out of political weakness. The Duke of Guise wasn't just a man. He was a symbol, a champion of Catholic France. His death wouldn't end the Catholic League's rebellion. It would transform him into a martyr and make their cause holy. "God grant," Catherine continued, each word a struggle against the fluid drowning her lungs, "that you have not become king of nothing." Within hours, her prophecy began its terrible fulfillment. Word of the assassination spread through Blois Castle like wildfire. The other deputies of the Estates General barricaded themselves in their rooms, terrified they were next on the king's list. The Duke's brother, Cardinal de Guise, was arrested and would be executed the following day, Christmas Eve, because apparently Henry had completely lost any sense of political timing. But the real catastrophe was the reaction from across France. When news reached Paris, the entire city exploded in fury. Preachers declared Henry III a tyrant and a murderer, no longer deserving of the title of king. the Sorbonne released all Catholics from their oaths of loyalty to the crown. The Parliament of Paris declared the throne effectively vacant. Within days, most of Catholic France had essentially seceded from royal authority. City after city declared for the Catholic League. The Pope would eventually excommunicate Henry III, casting him out from the Catholic Church itself. Everything Catherine had spent 30 years trying to prevent, foreign intervention, religious civil war, the collapse of royal legitimacy, was happening at once. Catherine listened to each disastrous report from her deathbed with growing horror. The woman who had orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, who had balanced Catholic against Protestant for 3 decades, who had survived every crisis through careful calculation, could only close her eyes and whisper prayers. Not for salvation, she was past that, but for her son, who had just signed his own death warrant. The assassination of the Guises had an immediate and catastrophic effect on Catherine's already failing health. The shock, the stress, the utter despair of watching her life's work crumble, it all accelerated her physical decline dramatically. The pleurisy entered its final, most agonizing phase. The fluid accumulation in her chest cavity had reached critical levels. Her physicians tried everything in their primitive arsenal: bloodletting to remove the supposed excess humours, purging to expel what they called putrid matter, heated cups applied to her chest to draw out the inflammation. None of it helped. Most of it probably made things worse, weakening her further when she needed every ounce of strength just to keep breathing. The infection had spread beyond her lungs now. Contemporary accounts describe a horrific smell beginning to permeate her chambers, the stench of internal decay that no amount of burning incense could mask. Her flesh was literally beginning to rot from the inside out while she was still alive. Servants had to be rotated frequently because many simply couldn't tolerate being in the room for more than a few minutes at a time. Christmas Day brought no peace to the dying Queen Mother. While the rest of Catholic Europe celebrated the birth of Christ, Catherine lay gasping in her bed, listening to reports of cities across France declaring against her son. Orléans, Toulouse, Lyon. One by one they fell to the League. The network of loyalty and fear that Catherine had spent decades building was dissolving overnight. She tried to dictate letters, still attempting to salvage something from the wreckage, but increasingly the periods of lucidity were interrupted by delirium. The fever would spike, and suddenly she wasn't in Blois in 1588, but back in Florence in the 1530s, or at her wedding to Henry II in 1533, or reliving the horror of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Her confessions during these delirious episodes became the stuff of legend, though historians debate their authenticity. She allegedly admitted to poisoning the Queen of Navarre decades earlier. She supposedly detailed other assassinations, other crimes committed in the name of preserving royal authority. But these accounts often come from hostile sources, written years later by people who had every reason to blacken Catherine's reputation further. What's certain is that she said things, terrible things, that made even her devoted ladies-in-waiting uncomfortable. The woman who had kept France's deadliest secrets for 30 years was now babbling them in her delirium, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop her. The worst part was her awareness during the lucid intervals. She would suddenly focus, recognize the people around her, and ask what she had said. When they wouldn't tell her, or couldn't because they had fled the room during her ravings, she would become agitated. The agitation would trigger more coughing, more pain, more of that horrible rattling sound as the infected fluid sloshed in her chest cavity. December 28th brought a new horror: convulsions. Not constantly, but in episodes that could last for hours. Her body would seize, her back arching off the bed, her hands clawing at nothing. The physicians had no explanation for this development. Modern medicine might recognize it as the result of severe hypoxia, her brain literally starving for oxygen as her lungs failed. But all her doctors could do was hold her down and wait for the episodes to pass. Between the seizures, she would sometimes become almost supernaturally calm. On New Year's Eve, she supposedly told her confessor, "I am ready." But ready for what? Death? Judgment? Or simply for the suffering to end? The irony of her timing wasn't lost on those who witnessed it. January 1st had always been Catherine's favourite day of the year. It was traditional for the French court to exchange gifts on New Year's Day rather than Christmas, and Catherine had always loved this custom. She would spend weeks carefully selecting presents for everyone, using the gifts as political tools, showing favour here, indicating displeasure there. This year, she could only lie in her bed, drowning in her own body, while the remnants of the court exchanged their gifts in hushed tones, pretending things were normal while their world collapsed around them. By January 3rd, Catherine could no longer speak coherently. The fluid in her lungs had risen so high that every word was a gurgle. Her lips had turned blue from lack of oxygen, her fingernails too. She looked, one witness said, like she was already dead, except for the horrible rattling sound that proved she was still fighting for breath. January 4th saw the worst of the convulsions yet. They started at dawn and continued almost without interruption throughout the day. Her ladies-in-waiting fled the room, unable to watch anymore. Only her confessor remained, praying continuously, though whether Catherine could hear him over the sound of her own drowning was doubtful. The end, when it finally came, was neither peaceful nor dramatic. It was simply mechanical, the gradual shutdown of a body that had endured far more than any human frame was designed to bear. Catherine de' Medici died as she had lived, fighting to the last moment, refusing to surrender even as defeat became inevitable. But Catherine's final torment wasn't destined to end with her last breath. The woman who had controlled the fate of nations for 3 decades was about to discover that even death wouldn't grant her the dignity she had been denied in life. Her body presented an immediate and grotesque problem for those left to deal with her remains. The infection that had been consuming her from within had progressed so far that decomposition had essentially begun while she was still alive. The putrid smell that had driven servants from her chambers intensified after death, becoming so overwhelming that even the professional embalmers struggled to perform their duties. Royal protocol demanded that Catherine be prepared according to the elaborate traditions reserved for French monarchs. Her heart and internal organs needed to be removed and buried separately, a standard practice for royalty. But when the embalmers opened her body, they encountered something that defied their experience. Her lungs were almost completely destroyed, reduced to festering masses of infected tissue. Her other organs showed signs of systemic infection that had spread throughout her body during those final agonizing weeks. The embalmer's report, preserved in court archives, describes finding her chest cavity filled with nearly 2 liters of putrid fluid, thick and yellow-green, with an odor so foul that several assistants vomited and had to be replaced. The infection had been so severe that it had actually begun eating away at the tissue of her lungs, creating cavities filled with necrotic matter. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the infection had spread to her abdominal cavity. The stress of her political situation, combined with the body's immune response to the lung infection, had apparently triggered a cascade of organ failures. Her liver showed signs of severe damage, possibly from the toxic treatments her physicians had administered in their desperate attempts to save her. The preparation process that should have taken hours stretched into days as the embalmers struggled with the unprecedented state of decay. They had to use extraordinary quantities of preservatives and aromatics. But even these measures couldn't entirely mask the smell of corruption that seemed to emanate from every fibre of her being. Meanwhile, the political situation Catherine had predicted was unfolding with terrifying speed. Henry III's assassination of the Guise brothers had triggered the most violent phase of the French religious wars yet seen. The Catholic League's response wasn't just rebellion, it was a systematic attempt to erase the Valois dynasty from history itself. Cities across France were declaring independence from royal authority faster than messengers could carry the news. The Duke of Mayenne, brother to the murdered Duke of Guise, had assumed leadership of the League's military forces and was marching on territories still loyal to the crown. Foreign powers were already positioning themselves to take advantage of France's collapse, with Spain promising troops and money to the League, while England quietly supported Protestant resistance movements. Henry III, meanwhile, had fled Blois and was desperately trying to rally support from whatever nobles remained loyal. But Catherine's dying prophecy was proving horribly accurate. He had indeed become king of nothing, controlling perhaps a third of what had once been his kingdom, forced to rely increasingly on Protestant allies, the very thing the Catholic League had formed to prevent. The cruel irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. In trying to eliminate his most dangerous enemy, Henry had created a martyr whose death was far more powerful than his life had ever been. Catholic preachers across France were already proclaiming the Duke of Guise a saint, murdered by a tyrannical king who had betrayed his sacred duties to protect the faith. As reports of each fresh disaster reached Blois, those attending Catherine's deathbed could only marvel at her political prescience. Even in her final delirium, even as her body literally rotted around her, she had understood the consequences of her son's actions better than he did himself. But the immediate problem remained: what to do with her corpse. Royal protocol demanded that Catherine be transported to Paris for burial at Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. But Paris was in open revolt against Henry III, controlled entirely by the Catholic League. Taking the Queen Mother's body there would have been suicide for anyone associated with the royal cause. The solution was a temporary burial at Blois, but even this presented challenges. The local clergy, sympathetic to the Catholic League, were reluctant to perform funeral rites for the mother of a king they now considered illegitimate. The few nobles who hadn't fled were terrified of being seen publicly supporting the royal family in any way. The funeral that finally took place was a pathetic shadow of what should have been a grand state ceremony. A handful of courtiers, some local officials who couldn't avoid attending, and clergy who performed the minimum required rituals with obvious reluctance. No foreign ambassadors, no representatives from the great noble houses, no crowds of mourning subjects. Catherine de' Medici, who had once commanded the respect and fear of all Europe, was buried with less ceremony than many provincial nobles received. The woman who had orchestrated magnificent court spectacles, who had understood better than anyone the importance of ritual and display in maintaining political authority, was laid to rest in virtual secrecy. Even worse, the temporary burial became permanent through sheer political necessity. Years passed, and France remained torn by civil war. The Catholic League maintained control of Paris, making it impossible to transfer Catherine's remains to their proper resting place. She lay forgotten in the church at Blois, while the kingdom she had spent her life preserving tore itself apart. Henry III's own fate validated his mother's final prophecy with brutal efficiency. Unable to sew together what he had torn apart, facing rebellion on all sides, he was forced into an alliance with his Protestant cousin Henry of Navarre, exactly the outcome the Catholic League had formed to prevent. On August 1st, 1589, less than 7 months after Catherine's death, a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément gained audience with Henry III. The king was in his private chambers when Clément approached with what he claimed were important documents. As Henry reached for them, the friar pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the stomach. The wound initially seemed minor, and Henry even joked about it. But infection set in, just as it had with his mother. Within 24 hours he was dying, his body consumed by the same kind of systemic corruption that had killed Catherine. His last words reportedly included an acknowledgement of his mother's wisdom. Mother was right. With Henry III's death, the direct Valois line ended forever. The throne passed to Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV after converting to Catholicism with his famous declaration that Paris is worth a mass. Everything Catherine had spent her life trying to prevent had come to pass within 8 months of her death. The Protestant succession she had fought against for 30 years was now reality. The Valois dynasty she had preserved through 3 sons was extinct. The Catholic unity she had tried to maintain while balancing Protestant interests had been shattered by religious civil war. The royal authority she had built up so carefully had collapsed into chaos. But perhaps most tragically, the methods she had used to maintain power had ultimately destroyed it. The massacres, the assassinations, the political manipulations that had kept her in control for 3 decades had created a culture of violence and mistrust that made stable governance impossible. Her son had learned her lessons too well, trying to solve political problems through murder, only to discover that some problems can't be solved with blood. The final insult to Catherine's memory came during the French Revolution, over 2 centuries after her death. Revolutionary forces, determined to erase all traces of the old monarchy, stormed Saint-Denis, where her remains had finally been moved during the reign of Henry IV. Her tomb was torn open, her corpse dragged from its coffin, and her remains thrown into a mass grave with dozens of other royals. Even this wasn't enough for the revolutionaries. Quicklime was poured over the bodies to accelerate decomposition, to literally erase their physical existence from history. The woman who had ruled France for 30 years was reduced to anonymous bones in a pit, her remains indistinguishable from those of her enemies and allies alike. Today, tourists visiting Saint-Denis pass by a small plaque marking the location of the mass grave where Catherine's bones lie mixed with those of 46 kings, 32 queens, and 63 other members of the royal family. The woman who once commanded armies and orchestrated the fates of nations is now represented by a few lines of text that most visitors don't bother to read. It's a fitting end, perhaps, for someone whose entire career was built on the understanding that power is temporary, that even the mightiest can fall, and that death comes for queens and peasants alike. Catherine de' Medici lived by the sword of political manipulation and died watching everything she had built crumble around her, her body rotting from within as her kingdom rotted from without. The smell that drove servants from her chambers in those final days wasn't just the stench of physical decay. It was the odor of a political system in collapse, of a dynasty ending, of an entire way of governing dying, along with the woman who had embodied it for 3 decades. In the end, Catherine de' Medici achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind she would have wanted. She became a cautionary tale about the limits of power, about the price of political survival, and about how even the most skillful manipulator can be destroyed by forces beyond their control. The 13 days she spent dying while her kingdom fell apart around her represent one of history's most perfect examples of poetic justice. The woman who had caused so much suffering in the name of preserving royal authority spent her final hours experiencing the ultimate powerlessness, watching helplessly as everything she had sacrificed her soul to achieve turned to dust. Her rotting body became a metaphor for the rotting kingdom she left behind, and the servants who fled from her stench were fleeing from the smell of an entire political order in decay. Catherine de' Medici died as she had lived, surrounded by the consequences of her own actions, breathing her last as France itself gasped for survival in the chaos she had helped create. Catherine de' Medici's gruesome end serves as one of history's most brutal examples of how power and mortality intersect in the most horrific ways imaginable. For 13 agonizing days, the most feared woman in Europe experienced the ultimate reversal of fortune, her body literally decomposing, while she remained conscious enough to witness the complete collapse of everything she had spent 3 decades building. The stench that drove hardened courtiers to their knees wasn't just the smell of infected lungs and rotting flesh. It was the odor of political decay, of a dynasty ending, of an entire system of governance dying alongside the woman who had embodied it. Catherine's physicians may have called it pleurisy, but what killed her was the toxic combination of physical disease and psychological devastation that comes from watching your life's work crumble in real time. Perhaps most disturbing is how Catherine's death perfectly mirrored France's condition. Just as infected fluids slowly drowned her from within, religious hatred and political violence were drowning the kingdom she had tried so desperately to preserve. Her body became a grotesque metaphor for the nation itself, rotting from corruption while still clinging to life. The woman who had orchestrated massacres and manipulated kings discovered in her final moments that death is the one opponent no amount of political cunning can defeat. Even Catherine de' Medici, master of survival, couldn't negotiate her way out of her own mortality.